you could say it's almost a blasphemous statement to make. Yeah, everyone's got these giving life to the dead and the clay bird, and then we get a book. It's almost like an anticlimax. So yet we say the Quran is the greatest miracle. What's the rationale behind this? What's the criteria? What criteria do you use to say that it's the most profound miracle? The fact is, if you were living during Musa's time and you saw the sea parting, one thing you would do, you would tell your children, or you would tell your grandchildren next to the fire one cold evening, and say, I saw Moses part the sea. And their children will tell their children, and their children will tell their children. Eventually it comes to the point where today is regarded as a story, and it doesn't really have a spiritual value or a spiritual connection. It's something that you read or see in Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. If you want to see a miracle, go to Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. They have the best miracles there. That's some visual entertainment going on for you. Whereas, therefore, so when the atheist or the agnostic, when he approaches a Christian and says to him, what, you believe that this guy Jesus did a miracle? And the Christian says, yeah, of course. He raised the dead, he did quite a few things. And the atheist says, oh really? Well, did you see it? The Christian says, no. Did your dad see it? The Christian says, no. Is it recorded somewhere on YouTube? No. So how do you know Jesus did a miracle? The Christian says, well, it's in the Bible. Well, how do you know the Bible is actually from God? At that point, they're a little bit stuck. Because they have this problem. How can you prove that the Bible's from Allah Azza wa Jal? There's a bit of a problem there. And that same atheist who's quite proud that he's dead to Christian, he now comes to the Muslim and says, so then, Abdul, what miracle you guys got for us then? Well, we got Quran. Oh yeah? Did God give it to you in person? No, of course not. The angel delivered it to you? Express delivery? No, of course not. So how do you know this is from God, divine? Well, let's sit down, let me show you. Is that part right there, let me show you. That's the part that we need to know. And this is a journey that everyone needs to go through, because it's very difficult. You've got to actually study it to convince yourself and to convince others. Because this is that journey to Islam, that journey to Quran. You need to start somewhere. And there's a number of ways you can actually go into this discussion as to let me show you. I'm just going to concentrate on one. At the start, I recited a particular ayah from Surah Al-Ibrahim. هَذَا بَلَاغٌ لِلنَّاسِ. This is a communication for mankind. Now, as communication, we understand what that means. As human beings, we naturally communicate. We communicate amongst each other, we communicate ideas, thoughts, we give instructions. We know about communication. But, for example, when I'm speaking to you now, when I'm communicating with you now, there are essentially three aspects of my communication. One is the speaker himself. Before this is human flaw, you could say, that before anyone speaks, you immediately pass some judgment as to what the person is going to speak about, based on their appearance, the way they dress, and so forth. So you immediately make some sort of judgment on the speaker. Let's look at it this way. Supposing you have a bit of a medical problem, let's say you have a skin problem, a rash of some sort, and your 6-year-old son or daughter looks at the rash and says, well, it looks like you've got some sort of eczema going on here. I think the best treatment to take for this will be such and such a cream, and apply it 3 times a day. Now, the information might be good, the advice may be good, but it's coming from a 6-year-old. Would you consider that source to be valid? Probably not. But if you were to go to a dermatologist and he was giving you the exact same advice, you would actually take that advice much more seriously. Why? Because you've taken the speaker into consideration. So the credentials of the person you get your information from is actually quite strong, it's actually quite important. Now, when it comes to Quran, especially in the early days of Makkah, we see 2 different responses from 2 different camps of people. One set loved the Quran, were mesmerized by the Quran, and the other set was so annoyed, so hated, so had such deep hatred to this book that they were willing to go to extreme lengths, even to kill, to stop the book from spreading. And one of the reasons why this is that we'll come to the first part of communication, which is the speaker. In Surah Al-Tahrim, Allah Azza wa Jal says, ضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا. Allah strikes an example. Allah struck an example. Now, obviously in this case, the example is being struck by Allah Azza wa Jal. Therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the speaker. Now for the believer, as believers, when we hear that Allah presents an example, we become immediately switched on. I can say to you, this is my example. Now, you don't have to take it, it's just I was a human being. It could be flawed, it could be biased, it could be subjective. But if Allah says, Allah strikes an example, as believers you immediately become much more attentive. Now for the disbeliever in Makkah, when he hears Daraballahu mathala, Allah strikes an example, the disbeliever immediately tunes off. Because it's just the fact that Allah has mentioned, he just tunes, it's not interesting to him. So he says that, I've heard this stuff before, you've been telling me for a decade, this Allah business, I'm just not interested, just change your tune. That's the typical reaction to the disbeliever of Makkah. So essentially, the mention of the speaker would make one camp, the believer, extra attentive, and the mention of the speaker would make other camp, the disbeliever, extra deterred, just by the mention of the speaker. And we see this concept of examples in Quran quite often. In Surah Al-Baqarah, for example, Allah says Allah is not timid to present an example of a mosquito. Now, in Surah Al-Hajj, now this is a Makki surah, Allah says, Ya ayyuhan nas, duriba mathalu. An example is struck. O people, an example is struck. Now here you find the difference that Allah has not mentioned. The speaker is essentially omitted out of this particular ayah. Now, you could say it's a bit of a strategy because once the speaker is mentioned, immediately people switch off. But the fact the speaker is not mentioned, that means that Allah is trying to open up a different way so people can actually listen. So therefore, Allah is omitting the speaker to bring them attention to a second part of communication, which is the content. So there Allah says, فَاسْتَعْمِعُوا لَهُ, listen to it. And the rest of the ayah actually speaks about how all the gods combined together cannot even produce a single fly. So why are these gods being worshipped? So the next part of the ayah talks about a parable, how a fly cannot even be produced. And you tend to find within Quran there are many parables, many similes and metaphors, or like literary devices you could say, for people to internalize a particular message. So it's actually a very important literary device that's used. Now, what we tend to learn from this particular ayah as well as other ayahs is that for any communication to be perfectly effective, all three components need to be profound. First is the speaker itself, the content or the speech, and then the style of speech. Otherwise, the overall effect will be lost, and the audience won't be affected in any major way. And if I, for example, give me an example. If I was to sit here and say to you, "Oh, people, you must pray. Make sure you pray on time, otherwise you're going to hellfire." If I say that kind of thing, immediately be deterred, because my style is actually very harsh. It's not something that you would like. I can say a lot of these things in a very harsh way. The content may be okay, or the advice may be okay, but because I'm saying it in such a harsh way, immediately you become deterred. Let's look at it another way. You go to Jummah Salah, and you speak, you see the Khatib, and the Khatib is a PhD Al-Azhari scholar. Obviously one of the best. He's sitting on the minbar and he's quoting ayat of Quran, he's quoting tafsir of Quran, he's quoting hadith, he's quoting the statement of the previous scholars. But the way he's presenting it to you is so boring that you find most people completely passed out. And this, you see this in many khutbahs. So what's actually missing there? It's the style of speech. The content is fine, divine content, ayat of Quran, the hadith is mentioned. But it's just the emotive speech. If I mention one particular name to you, Martin Luther King, now for most of you, when I mention that name, immediately a speech comes into your mind, which is what? I had a dream. Okay? Obviously, Shelby God knows it. But it's one brilliant speech. It's one of the best speeches of all time. And you can actually feel that zeal, that emotion, that enthusiasm that he has in there. But then if I say to you, what did the Queen of this country speak about in 2010? I don't know either. But it's the thing, she doesn't really have that style. Very boring very boring speaker. So we know something from Martin Luther King almost 4 decades away, but for the Queen a couple of years ago, we have no clue. And that's the thing, so it's the style of speech, that's the key here. Now when we apply this, it's a communication model to the Quran, we say that the Quran is miraculous, it's stunning, it's elegant, it's beautiful in the middle of 3 ways. Firstly, the speaker is incredible. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After that, it's what else? It's the speech itself. After that, it's the style of speech. Let's spend a few minutes looking at the speaker. Then we can essentially wrap up soon as well. For the believer, we know that Allah is the speaker, or is the author of this Quran. Now, for the disbeliever, on the other side of the spectrum, obviously, disbeliever Makkah or disbeliever today doesn't accept that this book is from Quran. The disbeliever says what? It's Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For the disbelievers in Makkah, they said that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the speaker. This is his speech. And we tend to find this default position of Makkah, and much later on, that this book is not a divine book. It's actually written by, spoken by a man called Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, even if you take this perspective that the Quran is the word of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even then it's something highly unusual, strange, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for 40 years of his life doesn't really say anything of any particular magnificence. He says things which are not necessarily of any historical value. And also when he starts receiving revelation, he says things about previous nations of a historical nature which left people completely baffled. One example is actually the individual Haman, which is mentioned in the Quran. Now, in the 17th century, Europe was going through, obviously, massive changes, radical changes. And Europe was becoming, you could say, a colonial power. And obviously, when you become a colonial power, there are essentially two things to colonialism. One is physical. If you want to colonize nations, one is physical, the other one is intellectual. So the Europeans, they developed a subject called Orientalism. Orientalism literally means study of the East. And in this context, it meant study of Islam or study of Quran. Therefore, what actually happened is that the Orientalists, they started looking into Quran to critique it, because they knew if they can critique Quran, it basically intellectually dashed the Muslims completely. So the scholars, the Catholic scholars normally looked into Quran, and in the 17th century they said, aha, we found a mistake in Quran. Allegedly found a mistake in the Quran. And the mistake centered around this character of Haman. Now Haman is mentioned in the Quran 6 times. I won't mention who he is yet, we'll come on to that in a moment. Now, is there Haman in the Bible? Yes? Old Testament book of Esther. Now, the Haman in the Quran, who did he work for? He worked for a man called Pharaoh. Now, did the Haman in the Bible work for Pharaoh? No. Haman in the Bible worked for King Xerxes in Babylon, which is current-day Iraq. Now, the Haman in the Quran was told to build a tower. Pharaoh said to him, build me a tower. The Haman in the Bible was told to build a tower by the King Xerxes. So what the Christians said, that Muhammad, what he did, he learned the story of Haman from the Bible of some Christians, and he came across this story about Pharaoh. He confused the two stories and made a mash of it. And they got confused, and that's where he made a mistake. And they carried on saying this for a good century. At that time, there was a concept of missionary invasion. The Ottoman Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, was being, you could say, penetrated by Christian missionaries, where Christian missionaries were producing pamphlets en masse to try and prove that the Quran is a flawed book, and it's not a divine book, but it's the book of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they went about this until a century later, 18th century, when the subject of Egyptology came about. Egyptology is, you could say, to do with pyramids, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and so on and so forth. And then you may have heard of a particular individual called Dr. Maurice Bukhari. He's an academic, a historian. He actually came across the Quran, came across the name Haman, and came across the passage that Haman was told by Pharaoh to build a tower during Musa alayhi salam's time. So Dr. Maurice Bukhari went to some Egyptologists in France and said, have you come across the name Haman in your research? And the academic says, well, no, where did you hear this name? Haman says, well, I've come across a document in the 7th century, he's referring to the Quran, that says that Haman was the chief minister of Pharaoh. And the French academic says, no, it's impossible. That name couldn't be known because that language had been dead for thousands of years before that. So it's impossible for him to know this. Therefore, what they said is that if you really want to know about this, go to Germany, go to the German documents.